Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome back to On Renewables, the podcast brought to you by the UAE Mission to IRENA, that's the International Renewable Energy Agency. I am your host, Nawal Al-Hosany, and I am the UAE's permanent representative to IRENA. And this is the podcast series that speaks to the most influential thought leaders in the fields of renewable energy, climate change, sustainability, and the environment about the issues shaping the world we live in. Thank you for joining us. My guest this episode is the United Nations Development Programme Administrator, Achim Steiner. Achim, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to On Renewables. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. A great pleasure to join you and to see you again.
So now, before we look at your career with the United Nations and professional experiences around the world, I would like to ask you about the Order of St. Charles, which perhaps not too many people know. It was confirmed to you by Monaco Prince Albert in 2009. Can you tell us the story behind it?
It was a great honor and a wonderful privilege. And you know, the Principality of Monaco had established this order in the 19th century, I think 1858, and it is a dynastic order that confers upon citizens and sometimes foreigners this recognition. And His Serene Highness Prince Albert, who, as you know, has been a lifelong advocate and champion for environment, for the oceans, for sustainability, chose, for reasons that I certainly I'm still very humbled by, to confer on me that order of St. Charles as a Knight of the Order. And obviously it's a recognition, I believe, for some of the work that I have done with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, with the United Nations Environment Programme, and certainly a now decades-long partnership with His Serene Highness Prince Albert. The second, because he was part, for instance, also of launching the Billion Tree campaign. He became one of the patrons with Wangari Maathai, and it was something that we launched together some years back, and was a remarkable illustration of how you get citizens involved in doing something about what happens in our world. So a great privilege and a great honor indeed.
Absolutely, and your work has been recognized by many others, and you know, we are very grateful to have you with us today. So Achim, your professional career have seen you work on assignments with governmental, non-governmental, and international organizations in many parts of the world, including, just to name a few, India, Pakistan, Germany, Zimbabwe, US, Vietnam, South Africa, Switzerland, and Kenya. I wonder, having worked in and experienced all those fantastic and fascinating and diverse places and cultures, is there something that you, as a global leader on sustainable development, take to be a key lesson or learning?
Well, I think one thing that certainly has a very personal experience is that when you have this opportunity to arrive in a country, a complete newcomer, you, in a sense, insert yourself into the society, the culture, is that we are an extraordinary human family. There is so much that we often think divides us, but actually when you have that opportunity to live amongst many different peoples and cultures, you realize that there is so much that actually we share and have in common. So that is certainly one very reassuring experience, and has made moving from one country to another increasingly not only easy, but very exciting for me. At the same time, I think you also learn to understand why people look so differently sometimes at the same things that we believe we see. You know, poverty can look very different if you're a wealthy New Yorker to perhaps being a person who, you know, is currently living in Afghanistan and sees the collapse of a whole nation around them. You know, the ability to partake in this extraordinary century in which we find ourselves, in the wealthiest century in human history, and yet inequality can be such a different experience. So I think perhaps the most profound lesson that I have learned in living in different cultures is that things can look very differently depending on who you are and where you live. And so both of these, I think, are lasting impressions that have shaped my outlook, but also my appreciation for trying to listen and understand and learn each time by seeing also the other person's vantage point, which is obviously a very important part of working in the multilateral and the United Nations system, because we are a family of nations.
Absolutely. Very well said. So one of the many things that you are working on is the UNDP 2022-2025 strategic plan and seeks to set the future direction of the UNDP. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about the plan and what will this plan bring to the development landscape, and how do you see your role within it?
Well, for those who may not be familiar, our UN organizations often get their license to operate through their governing bodies through these strategic plans. They lay out the objectives, the directions, the pathways, the investments for, in our case, 4-year period. And much of our work already in the last 2 years was to try and insert into the response to the pandemic a view of how to recover and recover better. We called it, in fact, building forward better. And here, clearly, we have some key priority areas. Inequality, poverty, and injustice remain fundamental drivers of either a society that can succeed or may fall apart. And so our strategic plan is very ambitious. It also embraces, first of all, that transition towards a more inclusive green economy out of this shock of the pandemic. And it also tackles issues such as climate change as true priority issues. So we have set ourselves very ambitious goals to scale up UNDP's support to countries, for instance, in the next 4 years, to enable them to create access to clean, affordable energy for 500 million people. We have never done this before, but we believe it speaks both to the essence of understanding how energy drives development, but also the imperative of acting on climate change. And so UNDP's offer as part of the whole UN development system is truly one that is cognizant of the short-term crisis, but fundamentally committed to a recovery pathway that will take us forward rather than back, because some are tempted to simply go back to where we were before. And that, I truly believe, is not an option.
Absolutely. It is, to your point, it's a decade of action, and we definitely cannot afford not to be very much determined on actioning things and making sure that we are moving forward. So how well equipped do you think the UNDP is to respond to these challenges that we face today, the pandemic, rebuilding social cohesion, and the climate crisis?
Well, in the last 4 years, we have invested heavily in a future of development perspective in UNDP. We call it the next generation UNDP. Just to give you a couple of examples, we have invested, for instance, in understanding what is the implication of digitalization, which will affect fundamentally every aspect of development. We have created a chief digital officers team. We have created a digital strategy, and we now have tools and services that we can offer to countries, the digital development readiness assessments, the kind of approach to understanding that digital is not just about the last mile of fiber optic cable. It's about building a digital ecosystem that is inclusive. So digital has been a significant part of readying UNDP for that next era in development. Strategic innovation, it's not an end in itself, but it must drive our understanding. So UNDP invested in the last 3 years in establishing over 90, what we call the UNDP Accelerator Labs, inserted into our country teams and truly focused on learning from the country within which they work, where innovation is emerging. And so these are just a couple of examples. And as we begin the new strategic plan this year, we have also established a sustainable energy hub, which is meant to provide, if you want, the touchstone within UNDP's there are hundreds of projects that we already support countries on the ground with in terms of environment, addressing access to clean energy, energy policies. All of this becomes part of a UNDP that is very much future focused and future smart.
Absolutely, absolutely. Achim, you mentioned something, and I want to go back to it. You said that under your plan, you aim to support 500 million people to gain access to clean energy. How will you make this possible? And what role do you see renewable energy have to play in having this increased access?
It is by doing what UNDP does best, which is to look at whole of economy, whole of society approaches. We are working on the one hand with countries and have supported them with our climate promise in the development of their national climate strategies, these nationally determined contributions. And these NDCs now need to translate into national development strategies and priorities, national budgets. And so our work from Glasgow onwards is really to help countries really become the pathway for national development. we are looking very much also at how we can help countries to invest, to mobilize capital. And then there are very specific programs. One that I think will be particularly illustrative of this, larger scale and ambition is the Africa Mini-Grids program. We are going to be supporting 18 countries across the African continent in rolling out mini-grids across their countries. And if you take these 18 countries together, they account for 307 million roughly of the people who have no access to electricity yet, which is half of Africa's, let's say, unconnected population to electricity supplies. So these are just a couple of examples with which we are scaling up our own approach, but also scaling up countries' abilities to really move forward on their own nationally determined contributions and climate strategies.
And that's actually extremely important. And you mentioned the Glasgow. So where we were at COP26, we saw how important it is to have an inclusive energy transition, and it was put in the spotlights with more small islands and developing states' voices being heard. But the question to you is, why do you think we continue to see such divide between those who have access to clean energy and those who don't? And why hasn't this been higher on the international agenda before now?
Well, I think there are, as always, multiple reasons and explanations. I think, first of all, let us remember we spent 20 years debating whether the science of climate change really demanded of us an energy transition. And I think it is only 10, 15 years ago that we truly began to see, at first individual countries and then increasingly the energy sector, really begin to enter a period of profound transformation. And I would actually argue that we are now in the midst of an energy revolution in terms of another set of technologies driving the future of energy and particularly the transition towards an electricity-based economy, which is really where, at least in the short to medium term, we will head as a global family of nations. But we also need to recognize that, very often the policies were not in place. Then the ability to invest, which is fundamental in such transitions, is obviously extremely different if you're an OECD nation or if you are maybe a least developed country or a small island developing states. And then we have a third major challenge that is still very prevalent. Fossil fuel subsidies. Our economic systems, our energy systems are essentially driven by the signals of the 20th century. We invest over $420 billion last year in actually subsidizing fossil fuel production and consumption. That's, in a sense, starting with a $423 billion signal against an accelerated transition towards renewables. But even with that, I think what we are now seeing is that the economics and the competitiveness of renewables is so compelling that essentially every country is now embracing that transition. The question is how quickly and whether they have the means. And here, I think UNDP, the United Nations, the international community, has an extraordinary responsibility. If we do not co-invest with poorer countries, then we will simply condemn them to not being able to make that transition. And that will not only be a tragedy for those countries, it will actually undermine our collective effort also at decarbonizing the global economy. And that is the challenge of our time.
Absolutely. And to your point, that I believe the world sees that and everybody's working together. One of the platforms that I'm sure you remembered we launched with Irina is ETAF, which is the Energy Transition Accelerator Finance, which is aiming to do just that. I'm going to move to another aspect of the work that you do currently with UNDP, which is climate promise. And as I understand it, part of this work is a report which analyzes the progress of the NDCs, the national determined contributions of countries committed to climate action. So can you tell us about this report and what it shows us about where we are on climate action?
Well, the report was one that we prepared in terms of an analysis of where the NDCs that were prepared in the lead up to Glasgow and were announced were signaling increased levels of ambition. And for us, what was very reassuring is that in well over 90% of the NDCs had higher levels of ambition for mitigation and very importantly also for adaptation. Now, we all know we are scrambling, we are running out of time, we are still too slow, but we're accelerating speed and momentum. So that is very important. And for us, that is also the reason why we are now in our climate promise 2.0, as we call it, are moving from the kind of planning and analysis to action and implementation. And indeed, our partnership with IRENA is really one of being joined at the hips in terms of trying to provide expertise, support, advice on financing. And much of our work as UNDP is really also at the level of the country to ensure that this is an inclusive technology revolution and energy transition. Otherwise, we are simply creating problems in another part of a country or in a society that will haunt us later on. So this needs to be a holistic, a development approach. And that is why we also argue very strongly that taking the NDCs, linking them to national development, and also making explicit the link to the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's not just about carbon dioxide emissions, it's about access to clean energy. It's about the ability to industrialize, to provide energy and electricity to rural areas, to poor people. That is all part of what now needs to happen. And our climate promise is very much one that is deeply embedded in this understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals.
What I really liked about the UNDP's climate promise is that despite the many challenges, it demonstrates that there are also reasons to be hopeful for the future. So can you share with our audience the reasons for optimism from your perspective?
Well, let me start perhaps with what may sound to some still like more a vision or a dream. I believe by the middle of this century, we will look back on the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, which were very much fossil fuel-based development centuries, as something of the past, because the transition towards clean and renewable energy is happening now so rapidly that I actually believe we are entering a period in which, perhaps for the first time in human history, access to energy, or particularly electricity, which will drive our economies, will no longer be a challenge in terms of scarcity or also some of the geopolitics that we have seen. So working back from 2050, what will accelerate that? Well, I think we're already seeing it. Extraordinary amounts of capital being invested from the private sector, national policies now ambitiously embracing net zero targets, decarbonization targets, and we're also seeing very practical results. So to those who believe that this is still an elusive goal or a vision that is unlikely to come true, I would say, wake up. The energy revolution has started and it will be exponential. And in that sense, there are reasons to be hopeful, but not, and I think we both would agree on that, complacent.
So who is leading the way on climate ambition, and what lessons can the rest of the world learn from that?
Well, factually speaking, our take would be to say least developed countries and small island developing states. If you analyze the NDCs and you look at the levels of ambition that these countries have introduced between Paris and Glasgow, certainly there is a remarkable commitment to act. But, you know, if you take all these countries together, they account for less than 7% of emissions. So what happens in the larger emitter economies around the world clearly is also fundamental. And I think here, as always, when you have these transitions, there are different arenas in which countries might be leaders. But, you know, the individual leadership is enormously important, but it has to be embedded in a global multilateral approach, because otherwise some will charge forward and others will simply take advantage of that by not acting.
So we're going to shift to another topic, which is the energy, water, food nexus. Changing the way we power our cities and even rural societies is going to be critical to tackling climate change, as you know. For example, as mentioned, almost 800 million people, including 600 million in Africa alone, don't have access to electricity. And we've seen with the energy, water, food nexus, this lack of access to electricity impacts people deeply on a human and economic level. So how do we go about tackling this challenge? What is the UNDP doing in that regard?
I think it is by going back to perhaps that analogy I provided with the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, we can sometimes literally design a project that could be under SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal on energy, which is about access and clean energy, energy efficiency, and, you know, in a sense, characterize it as an energy project. But in fact, it could almost identically be designed as an SDG 1 project, which is about poverty reduction, or SDG 13 on climate change. And I think this is where UNDP, I think, provides enormous opportunities to help countries to make an investment, for example, in access to clean energy for a rural community, let's say in a country such as Sudan, which needs electricity, both in terms of household consumption, but also for agriculture, irrigation, into something that has multiple benefits. And this is where our finance ministries, our investment world has been very slow to capture the multiple returns on investment. And this is why designing a response to the imperative of acting on carbon emissions, decarbonization, and moving to cleaner energy systems needs to be embedded in a cost-benefit analysis that captures these other elements as well. So the energy, water, food nexus is just one of the illustrations of how, in acting on one challenge or opportunity, design into it also the co-benefits that you can achieve. And I think this is where we begin to find ways in which, with soon 8-9 billion people, we can actually live in the 21st century on this planet without, in a sense, falling apart over access to natural resources, environmental degradation, pollution, because scarcity will be increasingly a phenomenon in a world of so many people, particularly with the consumption patterns also increasing. So efficiency, using technology and designing smart interventions, that is at the core of where I'm trying to lead UNDP's systems approach, embedded in that 2030 Agenda SDG, let's say, framework that we have all agreed on needs to guide us into the future.
Welcome back to On Renewables. We are still here with the administrator of the UNDP, Achim Steiner. Achim, we've discussed the big topics and themes of your expansive professional career with the UNDP and beyond. But now we would like to get to know Achim Steiner, the person. So I have some personal questions for you. Ready?
All right, let's go for it.
Okay, great. So here we go. What was your fondest memory growing up?
I think it has to be riding on a horse on that fazenda, that farm that I was born on in the south of Brazil. I literally had the great privilege of growing up on a horse, so to speak, because this is the cattle country, as you may know, of Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, that state. And my parents lived on a farm there. And so I literally, before I even could walk, was put on a saddle with somebody else. And so my memories will always be of that period really being tied to my horse and being able to just take off and have a lot of fun.
So from all your travels, is there a particular cuisine that stands out for you?
Well, I have to go back really to Brazil because, I grew up with churrasco, the Brazilian barbecue. And it is to this day the most unique food experience I would say one can have. And I obviously ask for forgiveness from all the vegetarians who think that this is probably not appropriate, but that's where my taste buds were programmed, so to speak. So a Brazilian churrasco has to be right there amongst the top ones.
Fantastic. So as someone who gives loads and lots of speeches and statements, what's your top public speaking tip?
I think know your audience. I always try to understand who is the audience I'm addressing, and in perhaps in even more simpler ways, don't lecture, but engage. I think these certainly, in my experience, have been ways in which even if you may have different viewpoints or, contested storytelling that you bring to an event, which I've often found myself obviously in, people do respect authenticity and the speaker showing respect to the audience. And then you can really engage in terms of what it is you're trying to share, to tell your story, But the departure point, I think, is the less lecturing, and the more you know about your audience, the more you're actually going to have an experience that is for both very productive.
What is the one piece of advice you would give your 18-year-old self?
Yeah, I mean, in these troubled times, it's sometimes understandable that young people, have a dark view of the future. And I think the first thing is find something that you care about. I think it's extremely important that our young people do not feel that they are powerless about what happens next, which is easy in both the pandemic context, but also in terms of technology and climate change. I mean, these are all things that feel like you have, as a young person, no influence over. I actually think the opposite is true. And we've seen that, for example, with climate activism, but also human rights or on development issues. And secondly, I think if you are pursuing a professional career, know who you are, but be open to opportunities that present themselves. The narrower one defines one's next path or step, the less likely you are going to find that open door that is waiting for you to walk through. And in that sense, remain open, remain flexible, but always remember who you are. And, I think it's as simple as that sometimes.
What is your one hope for the future?
Well, Nawal, I have to be honest, the thing that concerns me most in our world, and also if you look back to history, is that we often allow our political leaders to escalate the differences that we may have. We live in the 21st century. To believe that you can resolve differences by, armed conflict, going to war with one another, is so self-defeating. It is so painful. So my greatest hope is that citizens will increasingly challenge those who want to take us to war, whether with each other, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, but also as countries, because in this day and age, this could destroy us all. And I think in that sense, to me, one reason why I continue to believe so much in this idea of the United Nations, despite all the challenges it faces and that it also has to struggle with, the idea after 1945 is so powerful, so relevant, and so meaningful that I hope particularly young people can rediscover it, reinterpret it, and re-energize it. Because otherwise, there are enough people, unfortunately, out there in the world who believe that conflict serves them better than peace. And that is a great danger to us all.
Achim Steiner, it was an honor hosting you for On Renewables. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Nawal.
Thanks for listening to On Renewables. If you liked us, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave us a rating on Apple Podcast. And if you've got any feedback or questions for any of us at the UAE Mission, leave us a comment on our social media pages on Instagram and on Twitter. Thanks for joining us and see you next time.